They whispered it in back hallways of the industry, the words no one dared say out loud in front of a camera. They typed it in private group chats, deleted it moments later, and prayed no one took a screenshot. Were terrified of her. Retaliation. Not in a playful, oh she's just competitive way, but in the bone. Deep dread that makes you second guess every sentence you say, because you know the wrong syllable can cost you your career, and the woman in question is not some nameless shadow. She's Blake Lively, the actress America thought it knew, the queen of soft smiles, pastel gowns and magazine covers, but behind that curtain a reign of terror has escalated. So far the insiders now describe it as a full-blown control operation, and tonight I'm going to take you inside the escalation step by step, showing you why some of the most powerful people in Hollywood are scrambling to protect themselves before it's too late. It started quietly, almost too quietly for the average fan to notice, while the tabloids ran their carefully approved puff pieces about Blake's latest appearance or glamorous charity gala. Something else was moving in the shadows, a strategy one veteran producer described to me as the velvet knife technique, polite to your face until the moment you feel the sting. This wasn't about petty gossip or mild competitiveness, it was about locking down influence, eliminating dissent, and making sure no one even had the chance to challenge her. The first targets were subtle, smaller creators in the YouTube commentary space who began noticing strange strikes on their channels. Copyright flags that didn't line up with any clear violations, but all tied back in some way to content critical of Blake. These creators thought it was coincidence until they started talking to each other and realized they'd all been hit within days of each other. Then came the calls from lawyers, polite but loaded with implication. You might want to take that video down, it's in your best interest. And while those words might seem reasonable, anyone who has worked in Hollywood knows they carry the weight of a threat. Remove the content or risk legal hell. For one creator, it was a 12-minute breakdown of court filings connected to Blake's involvement in a lawsuit. For another, it was a video simply pointing out contradictions between her interviews and publicly available evidence. Yet in both cases, the response was the same: immediate pressure, quiet warnings, and a sudden flurry of behind-the-scenes activity. This escalation didn't stay contained to the digital world, though. In industry circles, casting directors began whispering that actors who spoke out about certain behavior found themselves suddenly off shortlists for projects. Producers who questioned budgets or creative decisions reportedly found studio executives becoming strangely unresponsive, and even within her own team, there were signs of fracture. Sources who once worked closely with her described the shift from collaborative energy to what they called an almost military command structure, every move approved or denied by a small inner circle whose loyalty was unquestionable and whose reach was formidable. The real turning point came when rumors began to swirl that Blake's influence had extended into the legal process itself, not just in terms of representation, but in active strategic moves designed to control narratives both inside and outside. The Courtroom one case in particular involved the mysterious leaking of partial documents, strategically redacted to protect her image while allowing damaging suggestions to linger around others. The press ran with these leaks, often quoting anonymous sources who all seemed to echo the same oddly specific talking points. It was a masterclass in information warfare, and for a while it worked. Critics were silenced, allies rallied, and her public image remained largely intact. But the more tightly she gripped control, the more cracks began to show. Industry veterans began whispering to journalists off the record, some even hinting they had receipts that could unravel the entire carefully constructed facade. The problem was getting anyone to publish them without facing the full weight of her legal retaliation, and that's where we enter the phase we're in now, the escalation, the point at which whispers turn into actions, and where those once too afraid to speak are beginning to realize that staying silent might be even more dangerous than telling the truth. And just when you think the whispers have reached their peak, when the stories of her sudden phone calls late at night, the unexpected unannounced visits, the veiled threats disguised as jokes had already left everyone in a constant state of unease. It escalates to a level no one saw coming, because insiders now say the retaliation isn't just emotional or psychological, it's strategic, it's calculated. It's targeted, like a chess master watching every move and knowing exactly which piece to strike. She has this way, they say, of making you feel like you're always one wrong word away from disaster, one wrong glance from being frozen out of entire circles. And in Hollywood, where perception is currency and silence is safety, people have begun doing anything to avoid crossing her, which only feeds the myth of her untouchable power. And yet behind closed doors, the cracks are showing. Her need to control the narrative has turned into an obsession. Insiders speak of secret group Chats with those who've been burned exchanged survival tips of coded language. They used to talk about her without using her name because even the suspicion that you've spoken ill of her is enough to earn a quiet but ruthless retaliation. And now with the latest legal maneuvering, it appears she's weaponizing the system itself. Sources close to the court filings claim she's instructing her lawyers to dig for any piece of leverage against those she suspects might turn against her. Not necessarily to win cases, but to keep them too busy, too scared to fight back. The way she's able to stretch a simple disagreement into years of drawn-out disputes is something that's left even veteran attorneys shaking their heads. One told Use off the record that in all their years they've never seen someone so adept at using the law not as a shield but as a sword, and the chilling part is it's all technically legal, which makes it impossible to stop without exposing yourself to more of her wrath. And this is why people say they're terrified, because it's not just what she's capable of doing, it's that she's willing to do it without hesitation. One former friend described the feeling as walking through a minefield, where every step you take could set off an explosion, and the terrifying part is she knows exactly where every mine is because she put them there herself. And so they smile, they nod, they pretend they're not afraid, while behind the scenes they're making sure every text, every email, every conversation could survive a subpoena. Because with her nothing stays buried forever, and now the pressure cooker is at its breaking point, because those who've stayed quiet are beginning to realize that silence isn't safety anymore, it's just another form of submission, and the first person to break that silence may trigger the avalanche that brings her reign of terror to an end, or proves once and for all just how untouchable she really is. The room was silent, but the tension felt like it was pressing against the walls. Every set of eyes locked on the witness, who shifted uncomfortably in their chair, their voice barely above a whisper, as they explained that the fear wasn't abstract. It wasn't paranoia, it was something they lived with every single day, because when Blake Lively set her sights on someone, she didn't just try to beat them, she tried to destroy them entirely. And that's what had people terrified, because it wasn't just about winning in court, it was about making sure that anyone who dared stand in her way would think twice before ever doing it again. The stories started pouring out one after another, accounts of intimidation that didn't come with screaming matches or public outbursts, but with carefully calculated moves that left no fingerprints, moments where careers suddenly stalled without explanation, brands pulled out of deals with no official reason, friendships dissolved overnight. After whispered conversations, and no one could trace it back directly to her, but everyone knew it was her touch, her way of doing things. Clean, quiet, and devastating. The fear didn't come from physical threats, it came from the understanding that Blake had reached that extended far beyond a courtroom. Her network in Hollywood was a web so tightly woven that if she wanted you silenced, you would be erased from opportunities. Without even knowing who made the call, it was that kind of invisible power that made people say we're terrified, because you couldn't defend yourself from something you couldn't see. And what made it worse was the chilling detail that came out next. Blake didn't need to lift a finger herself, she had people who owed her favors, people who didn't even need to be asked twice to make things happen, because they understood the unspoken rule: you protect her, you stay in her good graces, you get to keep your seat at the table. In an industry where a single bad whisper could end a career, people didn't take risks, and so they complied quietly, effectively, ruthlessly. And when those who crossed her ended up suddenly shut out from events, unfollowed by key influencers, ghosted by journalists, and abandoned by mutual friends, it became clear that it wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. The lawyers representing the plaintiffs knew they were up against more than just a legal case, they were up against a culture of silence that had been built around her for years. They began to present email screenshots and witness statements, each one showing patterns of communication that hinted at behind the scenes maneuvering, subtle but powerful. One email thread revealed a conversation between two brand executives discussing whether partnering with a certain influencer was worth the risk, given that Blake Lively was rumored to be unhappy with them. Another showed an editor quietly pulling an article from publication after receiving what they called a friendly tip about potential consequences, but none of these messages had her name directly attached to them. And that was the genius of it. She didn't have to be the one typing the words. The fear of her retaliation was so ingrained that people acted in anticipation of what she might want without being told explicitly. The court listened as one witness explained how they had been approached by someone close to Blake with a warning not to get involved in this case. They said it wasn't a threat exactly, more like advice, but the kind of advice that made your stomach twist because you knew it was a warning in disguise. And the more these stories were told, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about a dispute. over defamation or a smear campaign. This was about a pattern of behavior that went far deeper, a reign of terror that existed in the shadows of Hollywood. And the scariest part was that most people were too afraid to even speak about it on record. The lawyer asked the witness why they decided to testify despite knowing the risks, and the answer was almost too quiet to hear because someone has to, they said, and in that moment the entire courtroom seemed to shift as if everyone realized just how much weight that decision carried. But as the defense team prepared their cross-examination, it became obvious that they were going to go after the credibility of every witness, dismantle their statements piece by piece, and plant just enough doubt to make the jury hesitate. It was a dangerous gamble for the plaintiffs, because all it would take was one juror unsure of the truth to throw the case into chaos, and Blake's lawyers knew exactly how to play that game. They leaned into the idea that this was all rumor, all speculation, all the product of jealous rivals trying to tarnish the reputation of a woman who had built her career on talent and hard work. They painted her as a victim of targeted harassment, and as they spoke, you could see Blake sitting there calm, collected, and untouchable, almost as if she knew that no matter what was said, she would walk out of this courtroom with her power intact. But behind that poise, there was an undeniable truth. The stories being told might not all be provable in a legal sense, but they had a ring of authenticity that was impossible to ignore, the kind of authenticity that made people lean forward in their seats and wonder what else hadn't come to light yet. And if the plaintiffs had their way, a lot more was about to be revealed. And yet, even as the weeks dragged on and whispers of unease grew louder, there was this unshakable sense among those who had been targeted that the worst was still to come, because Blake Lively had not yet shown her full hand. And the frightening part was that no one could predict exactly how far she was willing to go in order to keep control. Her past maneuvers had already proven that she was capable of moving in ways that avoided detection until it was too late. By the time people realized what was happening, the damage was already done, and here now in this escalating phase of her so-called reign of terror, that fear was amplified tenfold. Sources close to the situation spoke of late-night phone calls that were never answered but left eerie voicemails suggesting consequences for speaking out. There were emails arriving at odd hours from anonymous accounts that somehow contained details no outsider should have known, personal details about family routines, work schedules, even locations visited. And while none of these communications could be tied to her directly, the people on the receiving end felt the unmistakable chill of being watched. The lawyer who had once defended her publicly was now telling associates off the record that the situation had crossed from aggressive legal strategy into something far darker and far less professional. And yet he too refused to attach his name to any formal complaint because, in his own words, were terrified of her retaliation. There were online campaigns that seemed organic, but upon closer inspection were traced to newly created networks of accounts, all posting in sync, painting her critics as liars, opportunists, or even mentally unstable. The overlap in language, timing, and imagery suggested coordination, but the scale made it nearly impossible to fight back without triggering more attention and more abuse. The terrifying genius of it was that the attacks were subtle enough to leave room for plausible deniability, yet devastating enough to shatter reputations one by one in closed industry circles. Conversations shifted from whether she was behind the targeting to how much longer she could sustain it, and what would finally push her over the edge, because the truth was that power like this never remained hidden forever, and as the intensity of her moves grew, so too did the risk of exposure. And in the midst of all this, Justin Baldoni's legal team began making strategic plays in court, pushing for disclosures that could shine a light on her communications, networks, and alliances. But each attempt was met with aggressive opposition filings, aimed not just at blocking but at punishing anyone who dared to pry. The tension was no longer confined to legal filings and courtroom scheduling. It was bleeding into real-life friendships, being severe collaborations collapsing as soon as her name was mentioned. And for those watching from the outside, the narrative had shifted completely. She was no longer the glamorous, untouchable figure she had been carefully presenting for years. She was now a storm cloud, a walking threat whose presence in any matter was a signal to tread carefully or be prepared for fallout. And yet here's the cruel twist: the more dangerous she seemed, the more people whispered about her, the more her myth grew, and in the strange, distorted way of power, the fear she inspired became another weapon in her arsenal. Because as long as people believed she could destroy, then they would stay silent, and that silence was her greatest shield. But what no one realized, not even her closest confidence was that a handful of people had stopped being afraid. They had started building a record, a quiet, meticulous archive of incidents, communications, and cross-references, and they were waiting for the perfect moment to bring it all forward, because if they timed it right, they could shatter not just her legal stance, but the very foundation of fear she had built for years. And in that coming clash, the stakes would not just be reputations or court outcomes. It would be survival in the most personal sense. And so here we are, the lights dim, but the fear remains. The witnesses who once believed they could speak freely now whisper in shadows. The legal teams who once thought they could predict every move now admit privately that nothing about this fight is predictable. And the public, those watching from behind screens with wide eyes and clenched jaws, are realizing this is not just a case, it is a demonstration of raw, unchecked power, and the people who have found themselves on the wrong side of Blake Lively's fury are living a kind of pressure that never lets up. One day, it's the threat of another filing, the next, it's a sudden media storm with headlines designed to destroy reputations overnight. The pace is relentless, the stakes are personal, and the intimidation factor is something no rulebook can fully address. What's unfolding here is a collision between image and truth, between the Hollywood sheen and the brutal reality of what happens when someone with influence decides that your voice must be silenced. And now the court is no longer just a stage for evidence, it's a battlefield for survival. Every move is calculated, every statement dissected, every slip magnified, and Blake Lively's shadow looms over it all. Her silence, her statements, her glances across the courtroom floor, they carry a weight that even seasoned legal veterans admit is unnerving, because behind the glamour, behind the designer suits and the measured interviews, there is a will to win that borders on merciless. And when that will is turned into action, it's not just a lawsuit, it's a storm that leaves careers, reputations, and sometimes lives in pieces. And as this chapter of the battle reaches its next critical moment, one question grows heavier than all the rest. If this is what it looks like when the fight is still ongoing, what will it look like when she believes she has truly won?